morning of the Rose Garden Fête dawned with the kind of golden perfection that makes one believe in the essential rightness of English summers. At Rosemere House, the grandest estate in St. Mary Mead, the ancient gardens had been transformed into a vision of organised festivity. Striped marquees dotted the emerald lawn like cheerful mushrooms, while bunting fluttered between the oak trees in patriotic splendour. The air carried the mingled fragrances of prize-winning roses, fresh-baked scones, and that indefinable scent of anticipation that accompanies all successful village gatherings. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself strategically near the tea tent, her knitting bag at her side, and her pale blue eyes taking in the scene with the gentle interest of someone who had witnessed countless such events over her many decades. She wore her second-best summer dress, a soft grey with tiny flowers, and her sensible hat provided welcome shade as she observed the bustling preparations. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you here so early." Mrs. Dolly Bantry approached with her characteristic energy, clipboard in hand and a slightly frazzled expression that suggested the morning had already presented several small crises. "I do hope you'll be judging the jam competition again this year. Your expertise is so valued." "How kind, Mrs. Bantry, but I thought I might simply enjoy the festivities today," Miss Marple replied with her gentle smile. "At my age, one appreciates being a spectator rather than a participant." This was not entirely true, of course. Miss Marple had discovered that people revealed far more about themselves when they believed they were unobserved, and village fêtes provided excellent opportunities for such observation. The centrepiece of today's event was undoubtedly the rose competition, held in Lady Rosemare's prized garden, where dozens of varieties bloomed in carefully arranged beds. Lady Rosemere herself, an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and an imperious manner, could be seen directing the final preparations with military precision. Her estate manager, Mr. Thornfield, followed her instructions with the careful attention of a man who understood that his employer's standards were exacting. "The judging should be quite exciting this year," Mrs. Bantry continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "We have Sir Reginald Fortescue coming down from London especially. He's considered one of the finest rose experts in England, you know. Lady Rosemere was quite pleased to secure his services." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly with interest. "How thoughtful of him to make the journey. I imagine the competitors are feeling rather nervous about having such a distinguished judge. Indeed, she could observe several villagers hovering anxiously near their entries. Mrs. Henderson fussed over her display of peace roses, while young Mr. Davies kept checking and rechecking the water levels in his vases. Even Dr. Haydock, usually the picture of professional calm, seemed unusually concerned about his contribution of Mr. Lincoln roses. As the morning progressed, the grounds filled with villagers and visitors from neighbouring communities. The brass band struck up cheerful melodies, children chased each other between the stalls, and the general atmosphere was one of contented celebration. Miss Marple noted with particular interest the arrival of Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, an elegant stranger who seemed to know Lady Rosemere but was unfamiliar to most of the village residents. At precisely 2 o'clock, Sir Reginald Fortescue made his entrance. He was a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, with snow-white hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. He carried himself with the confidence of expertise, nodding graciously to Lady Rosemare's introductions while surveying the rose displays with a practised eye. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Rosemere announced, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "Sir Reginald will now begin the judging. I'm sure we're all eager to hear his expert assessment of our village's horticultural efforts." The crowd gathered around the rose garden with the hushed expectancy of an audience at the theatre. Miss Marple found herself with an excellent vantage point near a particularly fragrant bush of Madame Isaac Pereire roses, from where she could observe both the judging and the reactions of the competitors. Sir Reginald moved methodically from display to display, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. He paused longest at Mrs. Henderson's peace roses, nodding approvingly, and spent considerable time examining the labels that identified each variety. Miss Marple noticed, with the attention to detail that had served her so well over the years, that the handwriting on the labels varied considerably, some in neat copperplate, others in a more modern hand, and at least one that appeared to have been written by someone in some haste. "Excellent specimens," Sir Reginald announced as he completed his circuit. "The standard this year is particularly high. Now, if I might have a glass of water before announcing the results. The afternoon is quite warm." Lady Rosemere immediately gestured to her housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, who hurried forward with a silver tray bearing a crystal glass filled with clear water. Sir Reginald accepted it gratefully and took a long drink, then set the glass down on the judging table beside his notebook. "Now then," he began, his voice carrying the authority of years of expertise, "I am pleased to announce that this year's winner—" But the words never came. Instead, Sir Reginald's face suddenly contorted in an expression of shock and pain. His hand flew to his throat, and he made a choking sound that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. The crystal glass slipped from his other hand, shattering on the flagstone path with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, no one moved. Then Sir Reginald collapsed forward onto the judging table, scattering rose petals and sending several vases crashing to the ground. The sound of breaking glass and the sight of the distinguished gentleman lying motionless among the prize-winning blooms shattered the afternoon's perfection as surely as the crystal had shattered on the stones. Dr. Haydock was the first to react, pushing through the stunned crowd with professional urgency. But even from her position several feet away, Miss Marple could see from the doctor's expression as he knelt beside Sir Reginald that his medical expertise would be of no use. "I'm afraid, Doctor," Haydock said quietly, his voice barely audible above the gasps and murmurs of the crowd, "that Sir Reginald is dead." The words fell into the summer afternoon like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through the assembled villagers. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her knitting forgotten in her lap, but her keen eyes were very much alive, taking in every detail of the scene before her. She noted the overturned water glass, the scattered rose petals, the expressions of horror and, was it, relief on various faces in the crowd. Most particularly she observed the small detail that everyone else seemed to have missed in the drama of the moment, the faint, bitter scent that lingered in the air near the shattered crystal, a scent that had nothing to do with roses and everything to do with something far more sinister. Murder had come to St. Mary Mead on what should have been the most perfect of summer days, and Miss Marple found herself once again faced with the fascinating and terrible puzzle of human nature at its darkest. The stunned silence that followed Doctor Haydock's pronouncement lasted mere seconds before shattering into a chorus of shocked whispers and urgent voices. Lady Rosemere, though visibly shaken, immediately assumed command with the authority of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Please, everyone step back," she called, her voice steady despite her pale complexion. "Mrs. Collins, telephone the police at once. Mr. Thornfield, kindly ensure the children are taken to the house." Miss Marple remained quietly seated, her knitting forgotten as she observed the fascinating spectacle of human nature under stress. The crowd fragmented into smaller clusters, each group buzzing with speculation, as if discussing the incomprehensible might somehow render it comprehensible. Mrs. Bantry appeared at her elbow, her earlier cheerfulness replaced by horrified excitement. "Miss Marple, can you believe it? Poor Sir Reginald, and at our little fete! Whatever could have caused such a sudden collapse?" "Most unfortunate indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her pale eyes following the various conversations blooming around the garden like worried flowers. "Near the tea tent," Mrs. Henderson gestured animatedly toward her abandoned peace roses. "Heart attack, surely," she declared to anyone within hearing. The excitement of judging, the responsibility. "These London types aren't accustomed to our country pace." "Nonsense," interjected young Mr. Davies, his face unusually pale. "Sir Reginald seemed perfectly robust this morning. He spent considerable time examining everyone's entries, asked about growing conditions, looked at all the labels." His voice trailed off uncertainly. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this detail. Labels, yes. She recalled the varied handwriting, including that hasty purple scrawl. Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the scene with professional care, looked up with a troubled expression. "I'd prefer to wait for proper examination before speculating about the cause," he said diplomatically, though his glance toward the shattered crystal glass was meaningful. The arrival of Inspector Slack brought temporary order to the chaos. He was an energetic man prone to hasty conclusions, and Miss Marple had encountered his methods before. After a brief survey and whispered conference with Dr. Haydock, he announced his verdict with confident authority. Clear case of natural causes, I'd say. Elderly gentleman, warm afternoon, excitement of the event. These things happen, unfortunately. But, Inspector, Doctor, Haydock began carefully, I really think we should consider... Consider what, Doctor? The man collapsed during a Rose judging. Hardly suspicious circumstances. Inspector Slack seemed determined to close the matter quickly. Miss Marple observed the subtle relief that flickered across several faces at this pronouncement. Mrs. Henderson nodded vigorously. Absolutely right, Inspector. Poor Sir Reginald was so enthusiastic about the roses. He examined my peace roses quite thoroughly, said they were exceptional specimens. He was very complimentary about everyone's entries, Mr. Davies added, though his voice carried a slight tremor. Very thorough in his examination of everything. Mrs. Pemberton, the elegant stranger, spoke quietly. Reginald was always meticulous about proper identification. Said you could learn as much about a gardener from their labelling as from their roses. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she absorbed these revelations. The conversation revealed far more than the speakers realised, particularly in what remained unsaid. She noticed Lady Rosmere's conspicuous silence and Mr. Thornfield's nervous glances toward the house. As the crowd began dispersing under Inspector Slack's direction, Miss Marple rose slowly, her keen eyes catching one final detail that made her pause. Where Sir Reginald's leather notebook had lain beside his judging materials, there was now only empty space among the scattered rose petals. "Most peculiar," she murmured to herself, then louder to Mrs. Bantry. "I believe I shall walk home now. The afternoon has been rather overwhelming." The two ladies made their way toward the gate, passing clusters of villagers still deep in animated discussion. The theories multiplied with each conversation. Jealous competitors, the strain of judging, even suggestions of deliberate poisoning, though these were quickly dismissed as too dramatic for St. Mary Mead. Dr. Haydock caught up with them near the entrance. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you noticed it too, didn't you? That peculiar scent near the judging table?" "Something bitter," she agreed thoughtfully. "Very faint, but quite distinct from the roses." He nodded grimly. "I tried to mention it to Inspector Slack, but he's convinced it's a straightforward case of natural causes." As they reached Miss Marple's cottage gate, Mrs. Bantry couldn't contain her agitation. "Jane, surely you don't think there's anything truly sinister about poor Sir Reginald's death? Not here in St. Mary Mead, with our roses and summer fate." Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, her gentle expression thoughtful. "My dear Dolly, I've learned that wickedness can bloom anywhere, even among the most beautiful roses. The question is not whether evil exists, but rather how to recognize it when it wears such a pleasant mask." The perfect summer afternoon had ended in tragedy, but Miss Marple suspected this was merely the opening movement of a much more complex and dangerous symphony. As the village settled into an uneasy evening, she found herself contemplating not just what had happened, but what had been carefully arranged to happen, and by whom. The following morning brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, as if the village were holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already turning over the previous day's events like pieces of a half-completed jigsaw puzzle. After a simple breakfast, she decided a morning constitutional would be beneficial, not for investigation, of course, but merely to enjoy the fresh air and perhaps encounter a neighbour or two. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Pentek was already deep in animated conversation with several early customers. The topic, predictably, was Sir Reginald's sudden demise. "Natural causes, thank goodness," Mrs. Henderson was declaring with obvious relief. "Inspector Slack said so himself. These London gentlemen live such stressful lives, all that rushing about in the heat, examining every little detail. My late husband always said excitement could be dangerous for elderly people." Miss Marple selected a few stamps while listening with apparent disinterest. Young Mr. Davies, she noticed, stood slightly apart from the group, his hands fidgeting nervously with his cap. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd tremor. "Sir Reginald seemed quite vigorous to me," he said. He examined everyone's displays so thoroughly, spent ages looking at the labels, even commented on the handwriting, said some of it reminded him of someone he once knew. Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this detail, though her expression remained pleasantly vacant. "How observant of him," she murmured. "These expert judges do notice the smallest things." After completing her purchase, she made her way toward Rosemere House, where she encountered Dr. Haydock returning from what was obviously a professional call. His troubled expression suggested the previous day's events continued to weigh on his mind. "Good morning, Doctor," she said pleasantly. "I trust you slept well after yesterday's unfortunate events." Dr. Haydock glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to see you. I've been hoping for a word. Inspector Slack may be satisfied with his natural causes verdict, but I have serious reservations." "Oh, that bitter scent near the judging table, for one thing. And something else. Sir Reginald's leather notebook has disappeared. He was writing in it during the judging, but it vanished after his collapse. I've preserved the water glass and some other items, just in case." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very prudent of you, Doctor." Missing notebooks do seem rather significant. Her next encounter proved even more illuminating. Mrs. Collins, Lady Rosemere's housekeeper, was hanging laundry in the service yard behind the great house. The woman looked haggard, her usual composure clearly shaken. "Miss Marple?" "How kind of you to call," Mrs. Collins said, though she seemed more distressed than pleased. "It's been such a dreadful business. We've scarcely slept." "I brought some of my gooseberry jam," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought it might be welcome." As they chatted, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in the details of the laundry. On the line hung a silver tray cloth, still slightly damp, with what appeared to be a faint purple stain near one corner, the sort of mark that refused to wash out completely. "You responded so quickly yesterday," Miss Marple observed. "Such presence of mind to fetch the water so promptly." "Mr. Thornfield said water, quick as you please," Mrs. Collins replied, lowering her voice. "I took the crystal from the cabinet. Lady Rosemere insists on only the best for honoured guests, and used the jug from the morning room. It was cool there, you see. Mrs. Pemberton had been waiting there earlier, writing a note at the little desk. Such lovely manners, though she does use that modern purple ink." Miss Marple accepted this information with a gentle smile, though internally she filed away every detail. Purple ink, a stained tray cloth, and a water service that had been prepared in a room where Mrs. Pemberton had been writing. The connections were beginning to form. Later, while purchasing tea biscuits at the grocer's, she encountered Mr. Davies again. This time, she noticed something that confirmed her growing suspicions. Around his fingernails was the faintest trace of purple staining, the sort that came from handling wet ink. "Such a shame about the judging being incomplete," she remarked casually. "I noticed some of the labels seem to have been adjusted." "The wind, perhaps?" Mr. Davies coloured deeply. "I might have straightened a stake or two," he admitted, "and borrowed a pen from the registration tent. Mrs. Hart writes in purple, says it shows up better, but only for a form, not for labels." "Of course not," Miss Marple said kindly, leaving him looking both relieved and more frightened. By afternoon, the pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind. The missing notebook suggested deliberate concealment. The purple ink traces connected Mrs. Pemberton, the water service, and possibly the label tampering. Sir Reginald's reputation for noticing handwriting details took on new significance if he had recognised something, or someone, from the labels. As she settled into her favourite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The village's eager acceptance of natural causes masked a more complex truth. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure Sir Reginald's death appeared innocent, but in their haste they had left traces. Purple traces that were beginning to paint a very different picture indeed. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious motives of Rose competition rivalry, but in something far more personal and dangerous. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a more direct approach to unravelling the carefully constructed deception that had turned a pleasant summer fete into the scene of a murder. Inspector Slack's transformation overnight was as dramatic as it was decisive. By 9 o'clock the following morning, the same man who had dismissed Sir Reginald's death as natural causes was striding purposefully through St. Mary Mead with the bearing of someone who had solved a puzzle that had been troubling him. Dr. Haydock's quiet persistence about certain inconsistencies had evidently worked its effect, and the inspector now moved with the confidence of a man who saw his case falling neatly into place. Miss Marple, observing from her garden gate as she tended her sweet peas, watched the small procession make its way toward the Davies cottage. The inspector's determined stride, the constable's official bearing, and the gathering crowd of curious villagers all suggested that St. Mary Mead's brief period of uncertainty was about to end with an arrest. Young Mr. Davies stood in his doorway looking pale and frightened, his hands trembling as Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious satisfaction. "I'm afraid I must ask you to accompany me to the station, Mr. Davies," the inspector announced loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "New evidence has come to light regarding Sir Reginald Fortescue's death." "But this is impossible," Davies protested, his voice cracking with genuine distress. "I never harmed anyone. I barely spoke to Sir Reginald beyond answering his questions about my roses." Mrs. Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, breathless with the excitement of unfolding drama. "Jane, can you believe it? Inspector Slack says Davies poisoned the water. Something about desperate financial circumstances and needing the prize money." Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet attention, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. Davies certainly looked guilty, but guilty of what exactly? The fear in his face seemed more the terror of someone caught in a lesser deception, rather than the horror of someone accused of murder. "The evidence is quite compelling," Inspector Slack declared to the assembled crowd, clearly enjoying his moment of authority. "Mr. Davies has been in severe financial difficulties, his market garden business failing, debts mounting. The rose competition's £50 prize would have been very tempting indeed. Moreover, he had ready access to agricultural chemicals that could prove fatal if introduced into drinking water." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived during the proceedings, interjected with professional concern. "Inspector, I really must insist on a proper post-mortem examination before we conclude." "Quite unnecessary, Doctor. We have motive, opportunity, and means. Davies was observed near the judging table multiple times, ostensibly adjusting his display. Most damning of all, we've found traces of that distinctive purple ink on his person, the same ink used to alter several rose labels, including his own." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this detail. The purple ink connection was indeed significant, but perhaps not in the way the inspector imagined. "Mr. Davies," she said gently, stepping forward with the unassuming manner that had served her so well over the years, "perhaps you might tell us about these labels." "The purple ink seems to have caused considerable interest." Davies looked at her with desperate gratitude, as if she had thrown him a lifeline. "Miss Marple, I swear on my mother's grave, I never harmed Sir Reginald. Yes, I borrowed Mrs. Hart's purple pen from the registration tent, but only to make some corrections to my entry forms." His face reddened with embarrassment. "My handwriting is so poor, and I wanted everything to look proper for such a distinguished judge." "What sort of corrections?" Miss Marple asked kindly, though her keen eyes were studying his face intently. The young man's shoulders sagged with shame. "I may have enhanced the descriptions slightly, changed homegrown seedlings to prize-winning stock on a few labels. Foolish vanity, really, but I was so desperate to make a good impression. My roses are good, but they're not championship quality, and I knew it." Inspector Slack waved dismissively. "Fraud as well as murder, then. The motive becomes even clearer, caught in deception, facing exposure, desperate for the prize money." But Miss Marple was studying Davies with the careful attention she usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. His distress appeared completely genuine, and his confession about the labels, while embarrassing, hardly seemed grounds for murder. Moreover, she had been watching faces when Sir Reginald collapsed, and Davies's shock had appeared entirely authentic. He had been among the first to rush forward, showing none of the careful distance one might expect from someone who had just committed poisoning. As Davies was led away, still protesting his innocence, the village buzzed with satisfaction at having their mystery solved so efficiently. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. "Always said there was something shifty about that young man. Too eager to please, if you ask me." Such a shame, Mrs. Bantry sighed. But I suppose desperation drives people to terrible acts. Miss Marple remained thoughtfully silent as the crowd dispersed. The inspector's theory was neat, logical, and almost certainly wrong. Davies might indeed be guilty of petty deception regarding his rose labels, but she doubted very much that he possessed either the knowledge or the nerve to commit murder by poison. More troubling still was what the inspector had failed to consider. If Davies had been desperate enough to kill for £50, why choose such an elaborate and risky method? A man with access to agricultural chemicals might more easily arrange an accident in his own garden, away from witnesses. And why would he have drawn attention to himself by repeatedly adjusting his display and using distinctive purple ink that could be traced directly back to him? As she walked slowly back to her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's events. Someone had been very clever indeed, allowing Davies's minor frauds to provide perfect cover for a far more serious crime. The real murderer, she suspected, was probably feeling quite pleased with themselves at this moment, watching an innocent man take the blame for their carefully planned deed. The question that troubled her most was whether this person would be content to let Davies suffer for their crime, or whether they might feel compelled to act again to protect their secret. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that murder, once committed, often demanded further deception to maintain its concealment. The afternoon brought news that reinforced her concerns. Mrs. Pemberton, the elegant stranger who had known Sir Reginald, had suddenly announced her intention to leave St. Mary Mead immediately, claiming urgent business in London. Such haste seemed rather suspicious in someone who had appeared to be enjoying a leisurely country visit. As evening shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her mind turning over the puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit Inspector Slack's tidy solution. The missing notebook, the bitter scent, the purple ink connections, all pointed to a more complex truth than a desperate young man's clumsy attempt at fraud and murder. Tomorrow, she decided, would require a more careful examination of what had really happened in those crucial moments before Sir Reginald's collapse. The real murderer was still free, and that was a situation that could not be allowed to continue. The morning after Mr. Davies's arrest found Miss Marple in her garden, ostensibly deadheading roses, but actually contemplating the troubling inconsistencies in Inspector Slack's tidy solution. The young man's terror had seemed genuine, his confession about the purple ink limited to his own embarrassing alterations. A true murderer, in her experience, rarely drew such obvious attention to their deceptions. By 10 o'clock she had resolved to examine the scene once more, armed with a jar of her gooseberry preserve as suitable excuse for calling upon Lady Rosemere. The lady of the house received her graciously, though the strain of recent events showed clearly in her pale complexion and restless hands. "How thoughtful, Miss Marple. These have been such difficult days, and now this dreadful business with poor Mr. Davies. One scarcely knows what to believe." "Indeed, most disturbing," Miss Marple agreed, settling her knitting bag comfortably. "I wonder if I might walk through the rose garden once more. I find flowers so soothing after unpleasant events, and I confess curiosity about the displays that so impressed Sir Reginald." Lady Rosemere readily agreed, and they made their way to the competition area. The roses bloomed with unchanged beauty despite the tragedy that had unfolded among them. The judging table had been removed, but the individual displays remained largely undisturbed, their labels still attached to stakes and vases. Miss Marple moved slowly along the beds, her keen eyes studying each handwritten identification with the careful attention of someone examining a particularly complex knitting pattern. Here was Mrs. Henderson's confident copper plate on her peace roses. There, Mr. Davies's entries with their obvious purple ink corrections where homegrown had been optimistically changed to prize-winning stock. But as she continued her circuit, something caught her attention near the foot of where the judging table had stood. Bending with the careful movements of age, she retrieved a tiny, pearly circle from between the flagstones, a reinforcement ring, the sort used to strengthen punched holes in paper or card. "How curious," she murmured, examining the small object. The official fate labels had come properly prepared with grommeted holes. Mrs. Hart was nothing if not thorough in such matters. Why then should there be a loose reinforcement ring on the ground? Continuing her examination, Miss Marple paused at a display of magnificent Queen Elizabeth roses. The blooms were indeed prizeworthy, but it was the label that drew her attention. While most of the competition cards showed the gentle weathering of a day in the garden, slight smudges, faint soil marks, the natural aging of paper exposed to sun and handling, this particular label appeared remarkably pristine. Moreover, it was written on different paper entirely. Where the official labels bore green borders and the Fates stamp, this one was plain ivory card of finer quality, its edge slightly deckled in the manner of expensive stationery. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, quite different from the various village hands she had been studying. "Lady Rosemere," she said casually. "This lovely penmanship. Whose roses are these?" "Oh, those belong to Mrs. Pemberton. She mentioned having some experience with roses from her time in Surrey. Such beautiful specimens, and she was so helpful during the preparation, offering to assist with various tasks." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, remembering Mrs. Collins's mention of purple ink and the morning-room desk where Mrs. Pemberton had been writing. How generous of her to contribute to the competition as well as attend it. "She seemed particularly interested in our judging procedures," Lady Rosemere continued. "Asked several questions about how Sir Reginald would examine the entries, whether he studied the labels carefully, that sort of thing. I thought it showed proper respect for expertise." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, like stitches gradually revealing their design. Sir Reginald's long pause at certain displays, his comments about handwriting reminding him of someone, his missing notebook, all took on new significance when viewed alongside a substitute label written on fine stationery by someone who had shown unusual interest in the judging process. "Mrs. Pemberton mentioned knowing Sir Reginald previously?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle curiosity. "Some professional acquaintance, I believe. She seemed quite knowledgeable about his work, though she was rather vague about the details." Lady Rosemere's expression grew troubled. "She left quite suddenly yesterday morning, claiming urgent business in London. Didn't even stay for breakfast." Miss Marple absorbed this information while examining the pristine label more closely. In the bright morning light, she could detect the faintest trace of purple ink along one edge, not the obvious smears that had incriminated Mr. Davers, but a barely perceptible mark that suggested hasty work by someone far more careful than a nervous young gardener. The reinforcement ring in her palm suddenly made perfect sense. Someone had prepared a substitute label on their own fine paper, reinforced the whole for durability, and replaced an original entry. But in their haste or nervousness, the reinforcement had come loose, leaving this tiny piece of evidence on the ground where only the most observant eye would notice it. Sir Reginald, with his expertise in both roses and the authentication of documents for insurance purposes, would certainly have noticed the discrepancy. His pause at this display, his examination of the handwriting, his missing notebook, all suggested he had recognized something significant about Mrs. Pemberton's contribution to the competition. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, studying the small reinforcement ring, "that poor Mr. Davers may have been arrested for a crime he never committed. The real question is not who altered labels for vanity, but who substituted them for far more serious purposes." As they walked back toward the house, Miss Marple's mind was already working on the larger puzzle. Mrs. Pemberton's sudden departure, her interest in judging procedures, her access to the morning room where the fatal water had been prepared, all pointed to a carefully planned deception that had used Davis's minor frauds as perfect camouflage. The truth, she suspected, lay not in village jealousies or desperate financial circumstances, but in whatever dangerous secret had driven someone to commit murder rather than face Sir Reginald's expert recognition of their true identity. The tiny reinforcement ring seemed to pulse with significance in Miss Marple's gloved hand as she made her way through the village that afternoon. Her mind worked methodically, connecting the pristine label to Mrs. Pemberton's hasty departure and the growing certainty that poor Mr. Davers was merely a convenient scapegoat. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Hart was arranging the afternoon mail with her characteristic precision. The purple pen lay beside her blotter like a small flag of evidence. "Such a troubling business with young Davers," Miss Marple began gently, "though I confess curiosity about our recent visitor. Mrs. Pemberton seemed so knowledgeable about our procedures. Mrs. Hart's expression sharpened with professional interest. "Funny you should mention that, Miss Marple. She was most helpful during registration, very particular about the labels, asked several questions about official procedures, who would examine them, that sort of thing. Even borrowed my purple pen for some correspondence." She paused thoughtfully. "Though I did notice she had her own fine stationery, quite different from our official cards." "How observant of you." "Did she receive much post during her stay?" "Several letters, actually." "All addressed to different names, Mrs. Pemberton, Mrs. Sterling, even one to V. Hartwell. She explained they were business associates, uncertain of her married name, but it did seem rather odd." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with growing interest. Multiple identities suggested someone with compelling reasons to obscure their true circumstances, reasons that might extend far beyond village rose competitions. Her next call was upon Dr. Haydock, who welcomed her with obvious relief. His professional conscience had been troubling him since Inspector Slack's hasty conclusions. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you've come. I've been thinking about Sir Reginald's background. He wasn't merely a rose expert, you know. His primary profession was document authentication for insurance companies, detecting forgeries, false identities, fraudulent claims. Made quite a reputation exposing sophisticated deceptions. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity." Sir Reginald's pause at Mrs. Pemberton's display, his comments about handwriting, his missing notebook, all suggested recognition of something far more significant than rose varieties. "Most illuminating, Doctor. I don't suppose he mentioned recognizing anyone at the fête. As a matter of fact, he did make an odd comment during the morning. Something about old cases catching up and being surprised to encounter familiar handiwork in unlikely places. I assumed he meant the roses, but now—" Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Collins, who appeared at the surgery door looking distressed. "Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple, thank goodness. Lady Rosemere sent me to find you immediately. We've discovered something rather disturbing." They followed her to Rosemere House, where Lady Rosemere waited in obvious agitation. "When we cleaned Mrs. Pemberton's room this morning, we found these hidden behind the wardrobe." She indicated a collection of papers spread across the morning room table. The documents revealed a fascinating and troubling story. Insurance policies, correspondence, and identity papers showed Mrs. Pemberton to be Mrs. Victoria Sterling, wanted by London authorities for elaborate insurance fraud involving forged documents and false identities. Most damning was a letter from a private investigator, dated 3 weeks earlier, warning that Sir Reginald Fortescue had been retained to review her case. "She must have learned Sir Reginald would be judging our competition," Lady Rosemere said, her voice trembling. "The timing cannot be coincidental." Miss Marple studied the papers with careful attention. The handwriting matched perfectly with the elegant script she had observed on the substituted rose label. Mrs. Sterling had indeed been far more than a casual visitor to their village fête. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Mrs. Sterling saw an opportunity to eliminate the one person who could expose her fraudulent activities. She volunteered to help with preparations, learned our procedures, and positioned herself to act when Sir Reginald inevitably recognized her handiwork." Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. "The purple ink traces that implicated Davers. She must have deliberately used the same distinctive ink to create confusion." "Precisely. She substituted her own label, knowing Sir Reginald's expertise would lead him to examine it closely. When he paused at her display, making notes in his book, she realized her deception had failed. The morning room where the fatal water was prepared provided the perfect opportunity. She had been writing there, had access to the water service, and could act without witnesses. The revelation cast the previous day's events in an entirely new light. Mrs. Sterling's helpful manner, her interest in judging procedures, her access to both the morning room and competition area, all had been carefully calculated elements in a plan to eliminate the one person who threatened her carefully constructed false identity. As they prepared to contact Inspector Slack with this new evidence, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony. Poor Mr. Davies, guilty only of minor vanity in enhancing his rose descriptions, had become the perfect scapegoat for a sophisticated criminal who had planned her deception with meticulous care. The truth had been hiding among the roses all along, waiting for someone with sufficient patience to notice that the most beautiful labels sometimes concealed the deadliest lies. The morning following their discovery of Mrs. Sterling's true identity brought news that should have provided relief, but instead deepened the mystery considerably. Inspector Slack arrived at Rosemere House with the satisfaction of a man whose case had taken a decisive turn, yet his expression carried an undertone of continuing frustration. "Mrs. Sterling has been apprehended," he announced to the assembled group in Lady Rosemere's morning room. "Detained at Victoria Station, attempting to board the boat train to Dover. The London authorities have confirmed her identity and the outstanding warrants for insurance fraud." Miss Marple observed the reactions around the room with her characteristic attention to detail. Lady Rosemere's relief was evident, while Mrs. Collins seemed to exhale a breath she had been holding since the previous day's revelations. Mr. Thornfield nodded with professional satisfaction, as if order had been restored to his carefully managed world. "Then Mr. Davies will be released immediately?" Dr. Haydock inquired. "Already arranged," Inspector Slack confirmed. "Poor fellow should never have been detained in the first place. Mrs. Sterling's confession was quite comprehensive. She admitted to poisoning Sir Reginald to prevent his exposure of her fraudulent activities. The case appeared closed, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by a nagging sense of incompleteness. Something in the too neat resolution reminded her of a knitting pattern where the stitches appeared correct but the tension remained wrong. Her concerns proved prophetic when, barely 2 hours later, urgent knocking at her cottage door brought news that shattered the morning's sense of resolution. Young Tom from the post office stood breathless on her doorstep. "Miss Marple, you must come quickly. There's been another incident at Rosemere House. Mr. Thornfield's been taken ill, and Doctor. Haydock says it's the same as what happened to Sir Reginald." The scene at Rosemere House was one of controlled chaos. Mr. Thornfield sat in the library, pale and shaken but conscious, while Doctor Haydock monitored his condition with obvious concern. The familiar bitter scent that Miss Marple had noticed after Sir Reginald's collapse lingered faintly in the air. "I was reviewing estate accounts when it struck," Thornfield explained weakly. "Sudden burning in the throat, difficulty breathing." "If I hadn't called out when I did," Dr. Haydock's expression was grim. "Same symptoms as Sir Reginald, but caught much earlier. Mr. Thornfield will recover, but only because the dose was smaller, or he reacted more quickly." Inspector Slack arrived, looking thoroughly bewildered. "This is impossible. Mrs. Sterling is in custody in London. She couldn't have poisoned anyone from a jail cell." Miss Marple studied the scene with renewed interest. On the library table sat a tea service, recently used. The delicate porcelain cups and silver spoons gleamed with the careful polish that marked Mrs. Collins's meticulous housekeeping standards. "Mrs. Collins prepared the tea?" she inquired gently. "As always," Lady Rosemere confirmed. "She brought it not 20 minutes ago. Everything was perfectly normal." But Miss Marple's experienced eye caught what others had missed. The tray cloth beneath the service showed the faintest discoloration along one edge, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. More significantly, she noticed that Mrs. Collins herself was nowhere to be seen, despite the household crisis. Dr. Haydock approached her quietly. "Miss Marple, I found something rather significant while examining the library." He produced a small leather notebook from his medical bag. This was tucked behind the bookshelf, as if someone had tried to hide it hastily. Miss Marple recognized it immediately, Sir Reginald's missing notebook. Opening it carefully, she found pages of detailed observations about the rose competition, including a final entry that made her breath catch. V. Sterling's handwriting confirmed on substituted label. Must confront after judging. However, more troubling is the household staff's obvious nervousness. Mrs. C. particularly agitated when discussing water service preparation. Recommend investigation of domestic arrangements. The implications were staggering. Sir Reginald had suspected Mrs. Collins even before his death, noting her suspicious behaviour around the fatal water service. Mrs. Sterling's presence had provided perfect cover for someone with intimate knowledge of household routines and access to both the morning room and the judging area. "Where is Mrs. Collins now?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Lady Rosemere looked around with sudden concern. She should be here, helping with the crisis. It's most unlike her to absent herself when needed. A search of the house revealed Mrs. Collins's room empty, her few possessions gone, and a hastily scrawled note on her dressing table, "Cannot bear the shame any longer." The London lady's wickedness gave me the idea, but the deed was mine alone. Sir Reginald would have ruined us all with his questions. The truth emerged in devastating clarity. Mrs. Collins, learning of Mrs. Sterling's fraudulent background and Sir Reginald's investigative purpose, had seized the opportunity to eliminate a threat to secrets of her own. Her access to the morning room, her knowledge of household routines, and her ability to prepare the fatal water service unobserved had made the murder possible. Mrs. Sterling's criminal activities had provided the perfect smokescreen. The attempt on Mr. Thornfield suggested he had grown suspicious or discovered evidence that threatened to expose her. The poisoned tea service, prepared with the same meticulous care that had marked her housekeeping, had been her desperate attempt to silence another potential witness. As the afternoon wore on and the search for Mrs. Collins intensified, Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony. The real murderer had hidden behind the obvious guilt of others. First, Mr. Davies's minor deceptions, then Mrs. Sterling's major crimes. In the end, it was the most trusted member of the household, the one whose access and knowledge made her invisible, who had proven most dangerous of all. The roses still bloomed in their beds, beautiful and innocent, while the truth lay buried beneath layers of carefully maintained respectability and domestic routine. As the search for Mrs. Collins extended into the evening hours, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that refused to align properly. She sat in Lady Rosemere's morning room, her knitting providing familiar comfort, while her mind worked through the accumulated evidence with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to untangling complex patterns. The confession note lay before her on the polished table, and she studied it with the careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate stitch. Something about it nagged at her sensibilities, like a dropped stitch that threw off an entire row of work. "Inspector Slack," she said gently, "might I examine this note more closely?" "The paper seems rather fine for household use." The inspector handed it over with barely concealed impatience. "Paper is paper, Miss Marple. The woman confessed and fled. What more evidence do we need?" But Miss Marple's experienced fingers detected what others had missed. The sheet bore the subtle watermark and blue ruling of quality stationery, the type used for estate correspondence, not the cheap tablets that domestic staff typically employed for personal notes. Moreover, the torn edge showed the clean cut of a paper guillotine, rather than the irregular tear of hand-ripped paper. "Most interesting," she murmured, remembering Mr. Thornfield's frequent presence in the library with the estate accounts. Mrs. Collins kept her household lists on a small board by the kitchen stove. I recall her handwriting quite clearly, neat, compact, with distinctive loops. This appears rather different. Dr. Haydock, who had been monitoring Mr. Thornfield's recovery, approached with Sir Reginald's leather notebook. "Miss Marple, there's something else that's been troubling me." This final entry suggests Sir Reginald suspected Mrs. Collins, but the handwriting analysis doesn't match what we know of her usual script. Miss Marple examined the notebook's final pages with growing interest. Sir Reginald's professional observations were meticulous, noting not just Mrs. Collins's nervousness, but also irregularities in household procedures that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of estate operations was manipulating events. "The poisoning method itself tells us much," she continued thoughtfully. "Whoever did this understood Mr. Thornfield's habits precisely, his preference for artificial sweeteners, his routine use of those small tablets. Mrs. Collins would certainly know such details, but so would anyone who worked closely with him daily." Lady Rosemere looked up with sudden concern. "You're not suggesting that Mr. Thornfield himself? But he was nearly killed." "Nearly," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A calculated dose that would sicken but not prove fatal, requiring considerable knowledge of toxic substances and their effects. Someone familiar with greenhouse chemicals, perhaps, who could estimate dosages with professional precision. The pieces were forming a different pattern entirely. The missing notebook had been hidden in the library where Mr. Thornfield worked daily. The confession note was written on estate stationery. The attempt on his own life had been carefully measured to appear genuine while ensuring survival. Even Mrs. Collins's convenient disappearance seemed almost too perfectly timed. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "that we may have been looking at this entire affair from the wrong perspective. Mrs. Collins's flight might indicate fear rather than guilt, fear of someone who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets." Inspector Slack bristled at the suggestion. "The evidence clearly points to the housekeeper. She had access, opportunity, and has confessed." "Has she?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Or has someone who understands both estate management and human psychology created a very convincing illusion? Consider the sequence. Sir Reginald recognizes something suspicious about the household operations. Mrs. Sterling's presence provides perfect camouflage for eliminating him. When that murder threatens to expose deeper irregularities, a second attempt becomes necessary. But this time, the perpetrator must appear to be a victim to deflect suspicion." The room fell silent as the implications settled. Mr. Thornfield, who had been resting quietly in his chair, suddenly appeared far more alert, his eyes darting between the assembled faces with something that might have been calculation rather than confusion. Miss Marple continued her gentle exposition. "The real question is not who had access to poison Sir Reginald, but who had the knowledge to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. Someone who understood document authentication well enough to recognize what would attract Sir Reginald's attention. Someone who could manipulate household routines without arousing suspicion. Someone who knew exactly how to stage their own near-poisoning to appear as another victim rather than the perpetrator." She folded her knitting with deliberate care, her pale eyes never leaving Mr. Thornfield's increasingly pale face. "I suspect, Mrs. Collins discovered something about the estate's financial management that threatened to expose years of careful embezzlement. Sir Reginald's investigation would have uncovered the same irregularities. Both had to be silenced, but in a way that would never point back to the person who had been systematically stealing from Lady Rosemere's trust. The truth hung in the air like morning mist, visible but not yet fully formed. Miss Marple knew that tomorrow would require a more direct confrontation, one that would force the real murderer to reveal themselves through the very cleverness they had used to conceal their crimes. The connecting threads were finally visible, and soon she would pull them tight to expose the web of deception that had turned a peaceful rose garden into the scene of calculated murder. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Miss Marple's sitting room as she arranged the tea service with particular care. Her invitation had been graciously accepted by all parties, though she suspected Mr. Thornfield's attendance was motivated more by necessity than social pleasure. A man in his position could hardly refuse such a gathering without appearing suspicious. Lady Rosemere settled into the chintz armchair with visible relief, grateful for any semblance of normalcy after the recent upheavals. Dr. Haydock positioned himself near the mantelpiece, while Inspector Slack maintained his official bearing despite the domestic setting. Mr. Thornfield, still pale from his supposed poisoning, chose a seat that afforded clear views of both the door and window, a detail Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. "Such a comfort to gather with friends after difficult times," Miss Marple began, pouring tea with steady hands. "Mr. Thornfield, I do hope you're feeling quite recovered. Such a dreadful experience, though thankfully not as severe as poor Sir Reginald's fate." "Much better, thank you," Thornfield replied, accepting his cup with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Dr. Haydock's prompt treatment made all the difference. Miss Marple smiled gently as she offered the sugar bowl. "I noticed you prefer those artificial sweetening tablets. Such a modern convenience, though I confess I find their bitter taste rather unpleasant." Thornfield's hand paused momentarily over the sugar bowl before selecting a conventional lump instead. "One grows accustomed to such things," he said carefully. "Indeed, familiarity breeds acceptance," Miss Marple agreed. "Rather like handwriting, wouldn't you say? One develops such distinctive habits over years of practice. Sir Reginald was particularly expert at recognizing individual characteristics in penmanship, part of his document authentication work." The conversation drifted to seemingly innocent topics, but Miss Marple's pale eyes never ceased their gentle observation. She noted how Thornfield's attention sharpened whenever certain subjects arose, how his professional composure required increasing effort to maintain. "I had such an interesting letter this morning," she mentioned, reaching into her knitting bag. "From Mrs. Collins, as it happens. She's been staying with her sister in Basingstoke, quite terrified by recent events. She'll be speaking with Inspector Slack shortly to clear up several misunderstandings." Thornfield's teacup rattled against its saucer before he set it down with deliberate care. "Mrs. Collins? But her confession—" "Ah, yes, that curious note," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Written on such fine stationery, quite different from the household paper she typically used. The handwriting, too, seemed rather forceful for someone of her delicate nature. More like the hand of someone accustomed to signing official documents, perhaps." The room grew unnaturally quiet except for the gentle ticking of the mantelpiece clock. Lady Rosmere's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension as she studied her estate manager's increasingly rigid posture. "You see," Miss Marple continued in her gentle way, "I believe poor Mrs. Collins discovered certain irregularities in the estate accounts, systematic discrepancies that would have attracted Sir Reginald's expert attention during any thorough investigation. Someone with intimate knowledge of both household routines and financial management would have found this prospect quite alarming." Thornfield's professional mask began to slip, revealing something desperate beneath. "This is pure speculation. Mrs. Collins confessed and fled. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked mildly, producing Sir Reginald's leather notebook. "His final entries make fascinating reading. He was quite thorough in documenting his observations about both the rose competition and certain administrative irregularities he'd begun to notice. 20 years of careful embezzlement leaves traces, Mr. Thornfield, especially to someone trained in detecting financial fraud." The accusation hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Thornfield's hands clenched and unclenched as his carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. "The second poisoning was particularly clever," Miss Marple observed. "A calculated dose designed to sicken but not kill, making you appear as another victim rather than the perpetrator. But you made one crucial error. You assumed everyone would be as easily deceived as your ledger books." Thornfield's composure finally shattered completely. 20 years, he whispered, his voice breaking. 20 years of taking just enough to go unnoticed. Sir Reginald would have found it all in a single afternoon. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose everything. Inspector Slack moved quietly to block the door as Thornfield's confession poured forth. The gradual embezzlement, the growing desperation as Sir Reginald's investigation threatened exposure, the calculated murder disguised as natural causes, and the elaborate deception designed to frame others for his crimes. As the shadows lengthened and Mr. Thornfield was led away in custody, Miss Marple reflected on the sad irony of it all. The man entrusted with Lady Rosemere's financial security had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way, turning responsibility into opportunity for theft and, ultimately, murder. The roses in the garden would continue blooming with unchanged beauty, but they would forever remind her that even in the most peaceful settings, wickedness could flourish if left unchecked by those willing to look beyond surface appearances to the uncomfortable truth beneath. As Inspector Slack led Mr. Thornfield away in handcuffs, the small group that remained in Miss Marple's sitting room sat in stunned silence. The confession had come so suddenly, yet with such devastating completeness, that it seemed to drain the very air from the room. Lady Rosemere sat pale and trembling while Dr. Haydock shook his head in professional dismay. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, setting down her teacup, "we might walk through the rose garden once more. I find that flowers provide such comfort after unpleasant revelations, and I believe the setting will help explain how all the pieces fitted together." They made their way to Rosemere House in the gathering twilight, where the prize-winning roses glowed softly in the fading light. Miss Marple positioned herself near the spot where Sir Reginald had collapsed, her knitting bag at her side, ready to unravel the final threads of the mystery. "The truth began, not with roses, but with ledgers," she said quietly. "Mr. Thornfield had been systematically embezzling from Lady Rosemere's estate for 20 years. Small amounts, carefully disguised within legitimate expenses. Only someone with Sir Reginald's expertise in document authentication would have detected such sophisticated fraud. Lady Rosemare's voice was barely a whisper. 20 years of trust betrayed. Sir Reginald's reputation preceded him, Miss Marple continued. His primary profession was exposing financial deception for insurance companies. Mr. Thornfield knew that any thorough investigation would uncover his crimes. When Sir Reginald began noting irregularities in domestic arrangements in his notebook, the threat became immediate. She paused beside the Queen Elizabeth roses, their elegant blooms unmarked by the tragedy they had witnessed. Mrs. Sterling's presence provided perfect camouflage. Her own criminal background and the substituted rose label created multiple suspects and motives. When Sir Reginald recognised her handwriting and paused to make notes, Mr. Thornfield realised his opportunity. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The water service from the morning room. Precisely. Mrs. Collins innocently fetched the crystal glass and water jug as instructed. But Mr. Thornfield had access to the morning room where the service was prepared. A few drops of poison, something from his greenhouse chemicals, added to the water jug would dissolve and concentrate in the first pour. Sir Reginald drank immediately and collapsed within moments. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. And the missing notebook, hidden in the library where Mr. Thornfield worked daily. He couldn't risk Sir Reginald's observations about financial irregularities being discovered. The purple ink traces that implicated poor Mr. Davies were pure misdirection. The young man's innocent vanity about his rose labels provided a ready-made suspect. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked. The second poisoning was perhaps the cleverest deception of all. When Mrs. Collins began asking uncomfortable questions about missing funds, Mr. Thornfield realised he needed to eliminate another threat while appearing as a victim himself. A carefully measured dose, enough to sicken but not kill, made him seem like another target rather than the perpetrator. The confession note was the final masterstroke, she continued, written on estate stationery and handwriting designed to implicate Mrs. Collins, though the formal script betrayed the hand of someone accustomed to signing official documents. Poor Mrs. Collins fled in terror, providing the perfect scapegoat. Lady Rosemere looked toward the house where she had trusted Mr. Thornfield with her most intimate financial affairs. All for money? For the fear of losing it, Miss Marple corrected gently. 20 years of comfortable deception had become a way of life. When faced with exposure, he chose murder rather than confession. The rose competition simply provided the perfect stage for his desperate performance. As the shadows deepened among the flower beds, Dr. Haydock asked, "How did you see through it all, Miss Marple?" "Human nature follows predictable patterns, Doctor." The too convenient confession, the perfectly measured second dose, the use of estate stationery, all suggested someone with intimate knowledge of household operations and legal procedures. Most telling was this afternoon's tea service when Mr. Thornfield avoided his usual artificial sweetener. A guilty conscience makes one suspicious of everything, even one's own habits. The group stood quietly among the roses as darkness settled over the garden. The beauty of the blooms seemed both poignant and eternal, a reminder that life continued despite human wickedness. "Justice has been served," Inspector Slack said finally, "though I confess your methods taught me much about observation and patience." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The truth always emerges eventually, Inspector. Sometimes it simply requires someone willing to look beyond the obvious explanations to the uncomfortable realities beneath." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected that the Rose Garden Fête would be remembered differently now, yet the roses would continue blooming, season after season, beautiful and innocent, while human nature played out its eternal drama of virtue and vice in their shadows. The murder among the roses had been solved, but the deeper lesson remained. Even in the most peaceful corners of the world, one must never underestimate either the capacity for human wickedness or the quiet persistence required to expose it. Truth, like the finest roses, required careful tending, but in the end it would always find its way to the light. The days following Mr. Thornfield's arrest brought a peculiar quiet to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath while processing the shocking revelations. Miss Marple observed this transformation during her morning walks, noting how conversations hushed when she approached, then resumed with renewed intensity once she passed. The murder among the roses had become the defining event of the season, though already the details were beginning to shift and embellish in the telling. Young Mr. Davies was among her first callers, arriving at her cottage gate with his cap in hand and gratitude written across his pale features. "Miss Marple, I can't find words proper to thank you," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the terror he had endured. "When Inspector Slack led me away, I thought my life was finished. The shame of those foolish labels seemed nothing compared to being accused of murder." "The truth has a way of asserting itself, Mr. Davies," Miss Marple replied gently, inviting him in for tea. "Your small vanities about the rose descriptions were perfectly understandable. We all wish to present our best efforts in the most favourable light." He accepted her kindness gratefully, and she noticed his hands had lost their nervous tremor. "Dr. Haydock has offered me work in his dispensary evenings. Says steady employment will help settle my nerves. I'm grateful for the chance to be useful." Mrs. Collins returned to Rosemere House 3 days later, her initial terror replaced by quiet indignation at having been so thoroughly manipulated. Lady Rosemere received her with characteristic grace, insisting that no blame attached to her faithful service. The household began the slow process of restoration, both financial and emotional. 20 years of trust betrayed for money, Lady Rosemere confided to Miss Marple during a quiet afternoon visit. The audit reveals he was extraordinarily clever, small amounts carefully disguised within legitimate expenses. Only someone with Sir Reginald's expertise would have detected such sophisticated deception. Inspector Slack's attitude toward Miss Marple had undergone a subtle but significant transformation. When he called to provide the final official details, his manner carried grudging respect rather than his usual dismissive efficiency. "The post-mortem confirmed concentrated nicotine extract," he reported, "available to anyone with greenhouse access, virtually undetectable without specific testing." Thornfield's confession filled in the remaining details: how he learned of Sir Reginald's investigative background, recognized the threat to his carefully constructed deception, and seized the opportunity provided by Mrs. Sterling's presence to create multiple suspects. "And Mrs. Sterling herself?" "Sentenced in London for her insurance frauds. Her presence at our fête was purely coincidental, an ironic twist that provided perfect camouflage for a more desperate crime. The village processed these events in its characteristic way, with initial horror giving way to fascinated analysis. Mrs. Henderson held court at the tea shop, explaining how she had always sensed something amiss about Thornfield's manner. Mrs. Bantry developed elaborate theories about criminal psychology that she shared with impressive authority despite having no particular expertise in the subject. The Rose Garden at Rosemere House continued its seasonal cycle, unmarked by human drama. Lady Rosemere decided to proceed with next year's competition, declaring that one man's wickedness should not destroy a tradition that brought joy to so many. A modest plaque appeared near the Queen Elizabeth bed, engraved with Sir Reginald's name and the dates of a life cut tragically short. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself in her own garden, tending to her modest rose bushes with the same careful attention she had brought to unraveling the mystery. The familiar routine of deadheading and watering provided peaceful counterpoint to recent events. Mrs. Bantry appeared at the garden gate one golden afternoon, her expression carrying the satisfied air of someone with village news to share. "Jane, they're saying Thornfield still writes letters from prison, trying to convince people that others were somehow involved. The man simply cannot accept responsibility for his actions." Miss Marple continued her gardening with steady hands. "Some people find it easier to blame others than acknowledge their own choices, Dolly. It's a common failing of human nature." As evening shadows lengthened across her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution. Justice had been served, the innocent cleared, and the guilty faced consequences for their actions. Yet she knew that beneath the village's restored tranquility lay deeper awareness of human complexity, recognition that wickedness could flourish in the most respectable circumstances, hidden behind masks of trust and routine. The roses would bloom again next summer, their beauty unchanged by the drama they had witnessed. The annual fête would continue, bringing neighbours together in celebration of simple pleasures. But St. Mary Mead had been subtly transformed by its encounter with calculated evil, made wiser perhaps, though at the cost of certain innocence. Miss Marple gathered her gardening tools as darkness settled over the village. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles and challenges, as it always did. But for now she was content to sit in her peaceful cottage, knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight, ready for whatever mysteries the future might bring to her quiet corner of the world. The truth had emerged, as it always did, through patient observation and unwavering faith in the fundamental order that governed both gardens and human hearts. Evil might flourish for a time, but like weeds among roses, it would eventually be recognized and removed by those willing to tend the garden with sufficient care.